Hebrews chapter 11 is the great faith chapter containing the names of some of our Bible heroes, most of our Bible heroes. And there you find names of Noah, Abraham, Sarah, David. Now, wouldn't it be a real surprise if the name of Moses was not included in Hebrews chapter 11? He is one of the most prominent characters of the Bible. His name is recorded about 700, and you just think about this, Moses' name is recorded about 750 times in the Old Testament. And even in the New Testament, Moses' name is recorded about 80 times. And then this is very telling, I think, about how great this man was. He was a type. Sometimes we talk about types and antitypes. The type in the Old Testament, the antitype in the New Testament, the shadows in the Old Testament, and then the real substance in the New. Moses is pictured as a type of the Messiah, the Christ who was to come. And Peter referenced this in the book of Acts chapter 8 and verse 3 as he went back to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 18 and quoted Moses. So he said, Peter did in Acts 3, 22 and 23, "For Moses truly said to the fathers, 'The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear in all things whatever he says to you. And it shall be that every soul who will not hear that prophet shall be utterly destroyed from among the people.'" And so the prophet Moses, he was a prophet. He was the lawgiver, Moses. He was the prophet, Moses. But Moses, back in Deuteronomy chapter 18, he pointed to the coming of Christ. But when he said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me," then you just think about the important place that Moses had in the great plan of God. He would raise up a prophet like Moses, and that prophet would be Jesus Christ. Our text tonight will be Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. Hebrews 11, 24 through 26, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward." A number of verbs are used in Hebrews chapter 11. Some we did not read in those verses. Some we did read in those verses. But verbs are used to describe the actions of this great man, Moses. And when you look at those verbs, well, then they give us insight into his faith and character. And that's what we're interested in exploring for a little while in our study tonight. The faith and the character of Moses. So, of those verbs that are mentioned, several verbs to describe the actions of Moses, we're going to look at 3 of them. And then in the conclusion, we'll look at a 4th. But in the body of the sermon, 3 of the verbs that we just read in Hebrews chapter 11. And the first is this. We see the faith and character of Moses in that Moses refused. Moses refused. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Have you ever thought about the emotional part of Moses' refusal to not be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter? For the first 3 years, for the first several years of his life, his mother figure was this Egyptian princess. He was called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. She held him, Pharaoh's daughter did. She held Moses in her arms when he was a little baby. Later, as he grew up a little bit, she sent him off to his tutors, in all probability. Evidently, she was always there for him during his early years. For all practical purposes, she was Moses' mother as he was growing up. Surely, Moses loved her and loved her dearly. But the day came in Moses' life when he was willing to say goodbye to her forever. He was willing to say no. And that's hard for a lot of people to say today. Sometimes when we ought to be saying no, it seems like we just can't form the word no. No needs to be said many times. And Moses was willing to say no to past relationships and to the only life that he ever knew in order to identify himself with the God of the Hebrews. He said no. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. When Christ was tempted by Satan in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4, 3 times Jesus said no. He refused to do the devil's bidding. Joseph, back in the book of Genesis, said no to Potiphar's wife when she made sexual advances toward him. He was only 17 years old. He was a captive in a foreign land. But he had some backbone, Joseph did. And it's seen in Genesis chapter 39 and verse 9, when in refusing the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife, he said, "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" He said no to Potiphar's wife. Because God was in his heart. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And this reveals something about Joseph's character even when he was just 17 years old. A person's character is revealed by his willingness to simply say no. When you're offered a drink of alcohol, say no. When you are invited to a party where there will be alcohol and drugs, say no. When you are tempted to click onto that pornographic website, say no. When you're tempted to do anything that is wrong, then have the character to say no. There was substance to Moses' character. He was not shallow in character. There was substance to his character. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He had the ability and the willingness to say no to those past relationships in order to serve the God of the Hebrews. So there's the first verb. Moses refused. Here's a second one. Moses chose. That's in verse 25 of Hebrews 11. So in Hebrews 11, 24 and 25, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing. You see, he was willing to make some hard choices. Choosing, rather, to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. The character of Moses is revealed in the choices that he made. The Egyptians who knew Moses, I mean, you think about the time that he spent there with them and the people who came to know him, they must have thought that he was out of his mind because he chose to join up with a bunch of foreign slaves, as the Egyptians viewed the Israelites, instead of enjoying all the advantages of living in Egypt. And there would have been a lot of personal and worldly advantages if he had just stayed in Egypt. But he chose differently. Moses chose to leave and to suffer affliction with God's people over staying in Egypt and enjoying the pleasures of sin. Moses knew that sin was enjoyable. He knew what he was giving up. But he also knew that the pleasures of sin were what the Hebrew writer calls passing. That is, they were fleeting. They were temporary. He had the good sense to see that lasting contentment and rewards which come from serving God and His people are better than the temporary pleasures of sin. And that speaks volumes about his character. Our Creator designed us with the ability to make choices. We are not like the lower forms of life which operate out of mere instincts. And you think about it. How many conscious decisions do we make on any given day? Probably hundreds. We make hundreds of conscious decisions every day. And most of them are inconsequential. We understand that. Most are inconsequential, but others are of great consequence. And they are of great consequence either for good or for bad. Young people have to make so many consequential choices. They are required to make choices which will affect the rest of their lives. And that's without having lived for 40 to 50 years and gaining wisdom through living life. There are so many consequential decisions that our young people are called upon to make based on the limited amount of time that they have lived on this earth. And those choices will affect the rest of their lives, and some will even affect where they will spend eternity. And they will have to ask, well, what will be my career? Will I choose to marry? If so, who will I marry? Who will I choose as my lifelong companion? You know, I've said it at other times. I've said it standing right here, and I'll say it again. And I'll say it for the benefit of our young people. Aside from your decision to follow Christ, who you choose to marry will be the most important decision that you will ever make in life. Because who you choose to marry will either be a great help to you or will be a great hindrance to you in your service to God. And we'll have a lot to say about whether you make it to heaven. Well, that's a consequential decision. who you marry. And that's just one of them. A lot of consequential decisions that young people have to make. But it's not just young people. Those of us who are older, we continue to make decisions in life, don't we? But as we do so, let's learn from Moses. Let's learn from the faith and character of Moses and make choices that are guided by our faith. Not making decisions flippantly or lighthearted or on a whim, but based on our faith. Guided by our love for the Lord. Guided by our ability to look beyond the pleasures and inconveniences that are right in front of us and look at future rewards which come from making godly choices. And that leads us to the third thing. I talked about here our ability to look beyond the immediate, look beyond the pleasures, the conveniences that are right in front of us. Don't you think it would have been more convenient for Moses to just stay in Egypt? And then there were the pleasures of sin that he could have had there. The pleasures of sin, all of the conveniences that were there, living up in the palace, being the son of Pharaoh's daughter. What a luxurious life. But he had the ability to look beyond those things and look to the future. Future rewards which come from making godly choices. So here's the third thing. Moses looked. Moses refused. Moses chose. Moses looked. So in Hebrews 11, 25 and 26, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing or temporary pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Moses looked. What did he look to? He looked into the distant future. Instead of looking at just what was right in front of him, the earthly things, he had the ability to look into the future, and he looked to the reward that would come from serving God and serving His people. He looked. Moses' vision was great. His vision was great. Listen to Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 7. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. Isn't that a remarkable thing about Moses' vision? I'm wearing contacts right now, and I couldn't see without them. Most of us, as we continue to age, we either wear contacts or glasses or both, which I do. But it says, even though he was 120 years old when he died, his eyes were not dim. His physical vision was great, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about his spiritual vision. And that's what the Hebrew writer is talking about in Hebrews chapter 11 when it says, he looked. He looked. He had spiritual vision. Think for a moment about the verb rendered looked in Hebrews 11 verse 26. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Now there's a word in the original language. The original language wasn't English. We're glad we have our English translations of the Bible, or we couldn't read our Bibles. Written in Greek. All right, well, what was the original word? What did it mean? It meant this when it was penned by the Hebrew writer. It meant to look away from. Look away from all else is the idea. Look away from all else and give full attention to another object. Now that's what the word meant in the original language when it says Moses looked to the reward. To look away from everything else, to look away from and to give full attention to another object. You know, Brother Sam in his prayer this morning actually made reference to that idea, that we might set our minds on things above, not on things of the earth, so that while we're here, we may give full attention to what we're doing here tonight in our worship to God. He's saying, looking away from the things of this earth. A lot of you people pray that, by the way, you men who come up here and lead in prayer, that we not be distracted from the cares of this world. What are we talking about? We're talking about spiritual vision. To look away from all else, to give full attention to another object. But when you men have been praying that, the object is worshiping God. Moses turned his eyes away from the things of this world and fixed his eyes on the object. One thing. He fixed his eyes on a reward far into the future. Moses looked to the reward. What did he look away from? We said that the word in the original language, the word looked, it means to look away from all else to give full attention to another object. All right, well, consider what Moses was willing to look away from. He was willing to look away from treasures in Egypt, besides the pleasures of sin mentioned in the previous verse. So you've got the pleasures of sin, verse 25, and then in verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, where he looked to the reward. He was willing to look away from the treasures in Egypt because he was interested in one thing. He was interested in the reward. In the 1920s, an archaeologist named Howard Carter discovered the 4-room tomb of a young Egyptian king known as King Tut. King Tut was only 18 years old when he died. I didn't know that until we made the Egyptian trip back several months ago, but he was 18 years old when he died. Howard Carter discovered his tomb, 4-room tomb of that young Egyptian king. At the time of the discovery, there were nearly 5,400 objects in that 4-room tomb. You think about that. Over 5,000 objects. Gold everywhere. Gold everywhere in that tomb. When me and Tracy were in Egypt back months ago, we walked into that tomb. And our Egyptologist, the guy that knows everything Egypt, Walik, he pointed out where Howard Carter lived, showed us his house. He took us to the tomb. We walked inside of that 4-room tomb belonging to King Tut, and we saw vast treasures in Egypt. We walked into that tomb, we saw vast treasures in Egypt. Kind of hard to walk into that tomb and not think about Hebrews 11:26. Moses was willing to miss out on vast treasures in Egypt. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal." Matthew 6, 19 and 20. We are challenged by Jesus then in this sermon. As His followers, we're being challenged to look away from the treasures of this earth so that we can give full attention to what we stand to gain in heaven. Look to the reward. Colossians 3:2, which Sam brought up in his prayer. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. Moses took his eyes off the glitter of this world and looked to what he stood to gain in the world that is to come. You know, we would do well to ask ourselves this question. As we combine these two things, Moses chose and Moses looked. Now, combining those two things, we would all do well to ask ourselves, do our choices indicate that we are looking for heaven, that we are living for heaven, or that we're just living for right now? Are we living for now, or are we living for heaven? All right, now we're going to think about one more verb, but this will be part of our conclusion. So we've gone through Hebrews 11, 24 through 26. Verse 24, Moses refused. 25, Moses chose. 26, Moses looked. Now verse 27, Moses endured. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible. He endured. Did Moses never sin? He had weaknesses. Moses did. And he made some serious mistakes. In fact, it was because of this that he was not allowed to enter Canaan. But after God graciously permitted him to at least view the land from a mountain, Mount Nebo, top of Pisgah, after that he died, and we believe he entered his eternal rest. In spite of his human frailties, Moses endured. When we call upon people to endure, when we call upon people to persevere, as the Scriptures did this morning, as I looked at passages that urge us to persevere, we're not saying we don't have weaknesses. We're not saying we don't have human frailties. We all do. Even Moses, as great as he was, had his frailties and his weaknesses. But in spite of them, he endured in serving God. How was Moses able to endure? Well, the answer to that's given right here in verse 27. How was Moses able to endure? Verse 27 says, he endured as seeing him who is invisible. That's how he did it. How did Moses see him who is invisible? He saw the powerful God in his deliverance of Israel from Egypt. Crossing of the Red Sea, that great miracle, and all that God accomplished before the Red Sea crossing with the plagues on Egypt, Moses, he had a front row seat to all of that. He was involved in all of that. He saw God. He saw God in His mercy extended to Israel during the wilderness wandering, the 40 years that they were out in the wilderness. Remember all the problems that the Israelites had? But God showed mercy. He saw God. He saw God in the mercy that He had shown the children of Israel. But then there's a third way that Moses saw God. He saw God in the same way that we can all see Him. And that is in creation. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, since the creation of the world, His invisible, there's that word again, invisible. Moses endured seeing Him who is invisible. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, Paul said. So that they are without excuse. Folks, when we're not serving God, I mean, we can see God. We see Him. We see Him in creation. We see Him in His perfect Word. We see evidence of God. And when we're not serving God, and when we are not enduring in service to Him, then we're just without excuse. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 6, and here we will extend the invitation. Hebrews 11, verse 6, the Hebrew writer said, without faith it is impossible to please Him, for he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. It might be, it just might be time for you to come to God and to please Him, and to do so now as we stand and as we sing.